Rights and privileges. What is a right? Right is something you should not require any sort of permission, or otherwise from any government authority to exercise. A privilege, for example, is driving a car, a driver's license. That's a privilege. It can be revoked by a government authority because of failure to obey traffic laws or whatever you want to call it. Now, Justice Clarence Thomas said that recently, some time back, the Second Amendment has long been a disfavored right, and that is correct. In other words, you don't need a permit, although this is debatable with regard to free speech, because municipalities often require a permit to have a demonstration or a protest. This is absurd, as those types of things should not be required. The idea that you need to get permission first to exercise freedom of speech is idiotic and shouldn't be even allowed. Secondly, we have the right to a free press. In other words, any person, Mark Twain once said, any citizen is a journalist. The notion that there is some fundamental difference between a blogger or a person like myself in the New York Times is nonsense. Constitutionally, there is no difference. This is another way to gatekeep, in other words, who gets to call themselves a journalist. And let's not use the term journalist. That's far too grandiose. It's a reporter. Your job is to report. Now, with regard to the freedom of religion, that's, of course, important. It also means freedom from religion, believe it or not. I have no concerns with whatever somebody wants to consider to be their faith. As Thomas Jefferson said, neither picks my leg nor breaks my pocket. Picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. What another person believes. Mark Twain himself said, faith is a private matter. The Fourth Amendment, of course, the right to privacy. There's no permit required to exercise that. The Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. Why is there's no permit required for that? Although in some instances, courts have said you have to verbally express that, which I don't understand either, quite frankly. The reason behind the Miranda warning was, the primary reason is because Americans are fundamentally unaware of their rights. And so now we come to the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment being the disfavored right, as Clarence Thomas said. Any scheme by government or state authorities to impose, in other words, a restriction on one's ability to defend oneself is absolutely absurd. First of all, if you're stopped by a police officer can run your name through their system right away. If you're carrying a gun, a firearm, and you are prohibited by law from carrying that firearm, well, you're in trouble. So the permitting system is simply a way, number one, for a government to raise revenue, if anything. In other words, that's the main purpose that it serves. For the same reason that speeding tickets that issued are not for the purpose of reducing speeding, because they don't. Their main purpose is to raise revenue. I find it, frankly speaking, absurd that people can sit up and say, well, I mean, sure, you know, freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press, but, not freedom to defend yourself. In some countries, I'll give you an example briefly. In Germany, for example, you can own just about any firearm you want, but you cannot carry one for self-defense, because in Germany it's the duty, or at least the government believes it's the duty of the state to protect people. Now, there is an argument to be made for that, but not in the United States. The United States is a very vast country, and I don't care where a person lives, city, town, country. whatever the case may be, a person has the fundamental right to defend themselves from any sort of grief that someone else might seek to impose on them. And for people who say that the Second Amendment was put in by the southern states, that's completely wrong. The main groups that wanted the Second Amendment inserted into the Constitution was the northeastern states, has been pointed out by several constitutional scholars. So spare me this argument. Any sort of permitting system beyond a check of some kind with regard to a person's criminal background is ridiculous. And let me just explain something to you. Everybody talks about the right to vote, right? Well, there is no right to vote. There is no affirmative right to vote anywhere in the United States Constitution. And the reason for that is complicated, but I won't get into it here. But when people go to jail, their right to vote is taken away from them, which means it's not a right. Because if it were a right, your right to vote could not be taken away. And when people are released from jail, they still don't have the right to vote. Some states are saying, well, okay, you can vote again. So in other words, voting in and of itself is a privilege because it is a discretionary grant from the executive. In other words, we vote by tradition and custom, not by right. Because if it wasn't a right, it would not be allowed to be removed from someone. Just like you cannot send a person to jail and say, well, you can't exercise freedom of speech or freedom of religion because, well, you're in jail. You understand? You have to, not you, I'm sure most people listening understand this. There is a fundamental difference between rights and privileges. And if we don't pay attention, even our rights will be abridged to the point where they won't be rights anymore. They'll just be temporary privileges.